Hello, and welcome back to AP Human Geography. Today we want to talk about human settlement patterns. Why are cities where they are? Why do they look the way that they do? And what's really going on in there? And how are they connected to each other? And when we talk about this, what we're really talking about is urban geography. So first of all, there are two types of settlements. There are the urban settlements, which are cities, right? High density, high population. And when I say density, I'm talking about population density. And then they're rural. These are going to be the country, low density, low population. Okay. And we've talked a lot about settling and why you would settle. We've talked about what kind of structures you might build, depending on where you live. But why settle, right? Well, you want all of the things that will keep you safe. And again, we've talked about that sort of thing. But just keep in mind, you've got to have water. You've got to have a defensible location. You have to have building materials. You need to be able to get wherever you need to get. You'd like to have shelter from the elements, whether that's flooding or weather or what. And you need to have fuel for cooking and warmth, especially cooking, because warmth may not matter depending on where you live. So which of the following, here's your first question, which of the following probably did not affect how our ancestors of 100,000 years ago built their shelters? Ideas from neighboring villages, hot weather, flood-prone areas, or available building materials. Well, we just talked about that. The one thing I want to say about this is, and we know the answer, by the way, is ideas from neighboring villages. It's kind of obvious, because I just listed off all those other things. But here's the thing. People would not really probably have come in contact with each other very often, different groups, 100,000 years ago, because we were a very, very tiny population, pretty spread out. So we didn't really have a lot of communication, but we did have to deal with the environment. Now, there are two things that we're going to talk about when we talk about settlement patterns. There's the situational characteristics, and then there's the site characteristics. And remember, the situational characteristics, that's going to be, where it is in the landscape, and we're going to want access to water and resources. Okay, so great places, water is going to be the number one concern. So we're going to want to be near a river, right, a coast, or a spring line or mineral deposit. Okay, but we've got to have water in some way. So these are great situational situations. I'm just kidding. They're great, situational characteristics. Okay, so site characteristics. Where exactly are you going to have it? You would like for your area to be dry, because we know that if you spend a lot of time damp, think trench foot, right? When people's shoes are wet all of the time, they get all sorts of horrible skin issues with their feet, right? But that could be with anything. Mostly it's going to be with your feet. So you don't want to be immersed in water a lot. You would like to have, of course, that river, but there are different places on the river. If you have a situation here, or site here, where you're in the meander of a river, okay, you have the river surrounding you, and this is great. That means there's really only one way in and one way out if it's a big river. The other thing you might want is a hilltop. Okay, you still want your water source somewhere close, but a hilltop is great because you can see people who are attacking you, and it's always better to not have to fight uphill. Okay, so that's a boon for you. Okay, now access to trade. You want to be able to be connected to other sites, and so crossroads are a great place because this is where travelers are going to converge. So you can see here's the settlement. Bridges force people to actually go through the settlement because that's where the river crossing is. And then valleys. It's hard to travel over mountains. You want to travel through valleys, and so people will be funneled right into your settlement. Also, the mountains provide shelter, so that's kind of a good thing too. And I've got this picture in here that I found that kind of puts all of this stuff together, right? And so here in this valley, this settlement is in a great location because it's not in the floodplain, it's near the bridge, it's protected by the mountains, okay, and it has this wonderful little river flowing through it. Plus, there's stone and trees for building. You have some grazing lands. You could even turn this into some farmlands because you had that floodplain, which means there's good soil. So all kinds of good things going on. And when you really start looking at cities, you can really see that this was well thought out for most places. Okay, so one of the most important things influencing land use today is going to be what? Original zoning in a city, building of freeways, siting of the cities, building of mass transit systems, or siting of the industries. Well, in modern times, it's going to be, again, that access to trade. I mean, you still need water, but we have other places we can get water when we can drill into the ground. So we can get it from aquifers. So we don't actually have to be at the river, on the coast, on a lake, or whatever. We can be in the middle of quote, nowhere for water, because there's water underneath us that we can access. But we still need to have that trade. And so railroads and highways are going to be great site characteristics. Okay, and so the answer to this is the building of freeways, because a freeway is a highway. All right, and then everything that I've just talked about is summarized in this little table, so check that out. All right, so in hamlets or villages, and we're going to talk about what's the difference between a hamlet and a village in a minute. In hamlets and villages where houses or other buildings are grouped in clusters, they are said to have a, what kind of settlement pattern? Linear, nucleated, dispersed, or elongated. Well, if you think about these words and the word cluster, nucleated is probably what you're going to come up with. So they are nucleated, yeah? And so settlement patterns, here you have this little cluster, you've got all these roads coming in, and here's an actual aerial photo. In this case, you're looking at a radial pattern, right, because you're kind of coming out. This is more of a star or finger pattern because you have kind of these little projections off of the main cluster. Okay, so those are two different kinds of nucleated patterns. You also have the dispersed pattern. This is what you're going to see with the farms that we talked about when we were talking about folk housing, lots of empty space in between the buildings. And then there are the linear towns. These are going to be the ones that surround a river or a road or the coastline, railways, whatever. And you can see that they are long and pretty much not very deep off the highway or whatever the central thing is. Now, we've talked a little bit about the earliest cities, and so the hearts of urbanization really come in the Middle East. The oldest of the cities are in the Middle East, whether it's Jericho, which is the oldest continually occupied city that we know of, from Turkey, to Turkey, where we had Lindsay-Hudak, and all sorts of others. Ur, right, is another city. They're all in the Middle East. They all needed a dependable water supply, a place to have domesticated plants and animals, building materials, and we've already talked about this, but remember that once you start having all of these city functions, you need to have a system of writing and records. And so, in early cities, you start to see the very first specialization, which is a key characteristic of city growth. Okay? And as cities grow, you get a change in the rural areas, and they become this thing called the hinterlands. And hinterlands are going to be the areas that are productive, the farming areas, the ranching areas that are surrounding the population center and supporting that population center. So these are the areas, kind of country areas immediately surrounding the city that support the city. Okay? And hinterlands is a term you really want to know. So when we look at the names, though, we've got rural areas, okay, and that's going to be out in the middle of nowhere. We also have hamlets, villages, small towns, large towns, cities, and conurbations. Now, isolated dwelling could be like rural, out in the middle of nowhere. A hamlet is a small handful of houses. That's it, right? It's just a little collection of houses. A village has a church, but it doesn't have a market. So it's got all those houses and a church. A town has those houses, a church, and a market. A city has houses, markets, right? And instead of having a church, it may have many churches, but it also has a cathedral or a university or both, right? And then a conurbation is a collection of cities that have kind of run together. And this picture right here is the Bosch corridor. And you can see here's Boston and here's Washington, D.C. And as you go through, you can see it really is just kind of one big old city. And there are a number of places that have gotten to be like this, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Not today. Okay, so here's a question. Let's say that you're in college. When you first met your roommate, she said she missed the connectedness of the people in the area where she lived. Homesick. Your roommate probably lived where? An urban area, a suburb, a city, an urban farm, or a rural village. Well, considering she's talking about connectedness, she's probably talking about a rural village, right? Because cities, urban areas, right, suburbs, or urban farms, which is part of an urban area, not known for their connectedness. So what we really want to do is define city. Okay, so what is a city? Well, a city is a politically organized region. It has infrastructure, it provides services, it has businesses, there'll be a culture that's associated with the city. Hopefully, it's a center of innovation and technological advances, but at the very least, the technological advances will occur in the city and then trickle out to the rural areas, and there should be, hopefully, robust economic activity. So, cities are going to be distinguished from each other by their size, dependence on natural resource-based occupations, strong traditions and cultural character, differentiated specialized jobs and functions, or large groups of interdependent households. Well, it turns out that you can define a city by what it does. Differentiated specialized jobs and functions. Okay? So all cities perform functions. They all have to generate income to support themselves because the city has to pay for those city services and the infrastructure, and that's going to come from the tax base and all that good stuff. But that's got to, that comes from whatever the city is supporting, right? Whatever industries the city is supporting. And each city is actually a piece of a larger economy, and so there are connections among cities. Okay, so when we talk about economic functions, we can kind of divide these up. You have your resource-based communities, and they're going to fall into two major categories. The industrial cities, like Detroit, Michigan, which was one of the big auto steel areas. It's in the Rust Belt. And they're going to be producing things that are going to be shipped out, right? So whether it's iron or coal or pharmaceuticals, right, food, whatever, okay? Transportation hubs, like Atlanta, which is a hub for airlines, those are going to be places where major transportation groups will converge. So rivers, railroads, roads, airports, okay? And everybody pretty much has to stop there before they go on to their final destination. Well, we've all had to either stop in one of those places or change planes or whatever. We think of it more in terms of airlines, but it's true for other forms of transportation as well. Now, tourist cities, these are areas like Jackson, Wyoming, where you have either spectacular landscape, like Jackson, Wyoming, or you have something that draws people in. Nashville has the country music scene, right? Things like that. So you've got not a product per se, but people are coming to see something there. Okay, and so you can talk about all these things, but then we want to talk a little bit about specialized cities versus diversified cities. Specialized cities have one function. They do one thing, and sometimes that gets you into trouble, like Detroit, which when the auto industry and steel industry collapsed, they did not fare well, right? Because that was their major industry, that's all they had. And so cities that are diversified, if one part fails, then they still have all of these other income producing whatever they're doing, income producing ventures that will bring in money. And so there's some benefit to being a specialized city. It's kind of like in biology. If you're a specialist, you're the best at what you do, and as long as nothing changes, you're always going to be the best competitor. However, when things change, it is the generalists that typically survive and do not go extinct. So specialized cities are like the specialists, diversified cities are like the generalists. Okay? And more cities are trying to diversify to protect themselves from economic collapse. So when we talk about the economic base, right, this is where the money is, where it's coming in and where it's going within a city, and there are two sectors. The basic sectors, this is the money that is flowing into the community as a result of whatever the city is exporting. That could be goods or food. It can also be in like tourist cities, restaurants, and shopping. I mean, Dallas has a huge restaurant shopping sector, right, if you will, but those are basic sectors. Non-basic sectors are going to be all of the jobs that don't generate new money, but I mean, they do require money, people get paid, you pay for it, but it's really the support of the internal functioning and producing goods for the residents of the city. Okay, so it's going to be like your schools, your emergency responders, medical, grocery stores, municipal workers, stuff like that. So basically you can divide it into this: things that bring money into the city and things that shuffle money around within the city. Okay. Now there's also something called the multiplier effect, which I think is something you always want to keep in mind when you start talking about the collapse of an industry or shutting things down or whatever. Let's say that you want to shut down a factory. Well, if you want to do that, you have to keep in mind that, let's say that factory employs 100 people. Well, you're not really going to lose just 100 jobs. You're actually going to lose about 400 jobs, okay? Because for every one, right, employee that you have at whatever that basic industry job is, you're going to have 3 jobs that are created in the non-basic sector. And actually, this is a picture of 4 people, I get that, but both of these are police officers, so I'm counting them as 1. Okay, so that's a really important thing to remember. Now, there is a thing called the central place theory, and it was generated by a man named Walter Kristaller, and he described how cities should be placed in relation to each other, like the spatial relationship, okay, and how far people will be willing to go to get various consumer goods, okay. And so basically what he said is that things that have relatively low value, low thresholds, right, people are not going to drive very far to get or go very far. Things that have a really high value, people will travel long distances to get to those sorts of things. So, according to the range concept of the central place theory, people should be willing to travel short distances for what? Cup of coffee, groceries, and a fast food restaurant, rare books and collectibles, tax services and banks, wedding dresses. Well, short distances are things of low value, so that's going to be like a cup of coffee. You're not going to go 15 miles to get a cup of coffee. I mean, you might, but that's not really the norm. But you might, however, be willing to fly to another city to get a wedding dress. Just throwing it out there. There's all fill in the blank there for something really valuable. Okay. Now, okay, when you start looking at these relationships, there is a pattern that's predicted by this model that's called the hexagon model. And so you'll have large settlements, right, that provide more expensive, less frequently purchased items. They'll serve more customers, okay? These are the high-level cities, things like New York and Los Angeles. Then there are next tier down cities, Miami, Seattle, maybe Chicago, right? Dallas, right? And then you keep going until you get smaller and smaller and smaller. Okay? And it ends up looking, this relationship, something like this. So I have this city, I have this city, and I have this city. Well, these people here might go to this city or this city, depending. These people here might go to this city or this city, depending, right? And so when you start expanding out the circles to include everybody, if these are 3 cities, then you end up getting this interesting hexagonal model. And when you start putting in towns and cities and villages and hamlets, so here's a city, here's another city, so this is going to be, right, the threshold, there we go, for this city, okay, and this is going to be the threshold for this town, right, to there. But here's the deal, these people in this town are probably willing to drive to this city because the city is going to offer more things, okay, and so this city to this city is that hexagon. I know this is a little bit confusing looking, but it makes sense if you start looking at the colors, right? And so you have little hamlets. Oh, there's a little hamlet. It's very tiny. Here's a little hamlet, very tiny. Oh, sorry, that's a village. My bad. There's a little hamlet. There's a little village. But you can see the little black hexagons are going to be around the hamlets. The red ones are going to be around the villages, right? The pretty teal ones are around the towns, and then the green ones are around the cities. And you can see the relationships here. These people are not going to go outside of this black circle, or hexagon, for a cup of coffee. They may be willing to go anywhere in this red hexagon for something else, a restaurant, right? And then you get the picture from there. It widens out and out and out. Okay, so what are the impacts of this? Okay, now obviously not all cities are going to fit exactly into this hexagonal model, although it is pretty interesting that it works pretty well, okay? But the power lies in this ability to analyze growth patterns, and it explains why cities grow and why cities shrink, okay? And if you look at a really classic example of 2 cities, Phoenix and Houston, they have grown. Dallas too has grown and grown and grown, whereas cities in the Northeast are actually shrinking. They're getting smaller, okay? Why is that? Well, we've got increased immigration from Latin America, and we're all relatively close to the border, but there's cheap land out here, and so the military actually has bought land, right? And they build bases, okay? And when you have groups that are now allowed to be in different places and you have people having the freedom to move, okay, you're going to need more services, increasing the level of that city in the hierarchy, okay? And cities can move up and cities can move down in the hierarchical ladder, and we'll talk about that later on, okay, the urban hierarchy. Okay, so in the core periphery model, right, this is a different idea. This is going to be a world systems theory. So the central place theory talks about cities in fairly close proximity to each other. But how does that work for the world? So this is the core periphery model, and Wallerstein is the person who came up with this. And it turns out that you can probably divide most countries into these three categories: the core, the semi-periphery, and the periphery. And if you actually look at these, it is the most developed countries, developing, and the least developed countries is really what you're looking at, okay? And so that's the core periphery model, and it's pretty true. Okay, so when you look at the core periphery models, the core are going to be the developed nations, the semi-periphery are going to be the developing nations, and the periphery are all of the developed nations. This used to be the first, second, and third worlds. That is not politically correct anymore, and so we're using core, semi-periphery, periphery, or MDCs, developing, or LDCs. Okay, and then here you have world cities. World cities are going to be defined by the number of specialized functions and economic power that they have, and so you can see that you've got some really large cities, okay, 5 million and over. Once you get to 10 million, you're considered a mega city. Okay, and then when we start looking at the urban population, really lots and lots of people live in cities, but you'll notice that, of course, in the developed and developing, like higher developing countries, you're going to have more cities, whereas in the least developing countries, you're going to have more rural areas. Okay, so that's it for this one. If you have any questions, please let me know, and I will see you next time. Thanks for listening.